Hello. You can hear me fine? Yeah, I can hear my own echoes. Welcome to this presidential highlighted session on a very important topic, problematizing inclusion / I don't know how to even describe it, / align exclusion. My name is Riyad Shah Jahan, and I'm a faculty member at Michigan State University, and I have the pleasure and honor of chairing this session. We are going to follow the order that's in the app rather than the program. So we'll have first our talk from Stephen Carney, followed by Lynn Fendler, and then we'll end with Danny Friedrich. All right? Okay, thank you very much. Can you all hear me? Okay. Can you hear me? That's good? Great. Okay, so let me start by saying thank you to Noah for inviting me. It's a real honor to be in a group such as this. In my 15 to 20 minutes, I'm going to take a different tact from a lot of the other presentations we've heard and talk about complexity, confusion, fear, loss, death, and ultimately a different type of research awareness. Whilst what I'm talking about is well known, even old hat, in some educational research communities, it remains an uncomfortable orientation within much of comparative education. As many of you know, Noah and I were instrumental in starting, or at least developing, the Globalization in Education SIG from what was a very small following into what is now one of the major sub-communities within CIES. I think we both felt that the notion of globalization, especially when connected to French theory, had the analytic potential to alter some of the key assumptions of the field. Personally, I feel that that vision has only been partially realized. As this community has grown, I've noticed a remarkable rise in what I'll call global education policy studies, often at the expense of open-ended, transgressive, philosophically informed interdisciplinary work aimed at exploring the key assumptions underpinning notions such as agency and subjectivity, state and culture, and the purposes and potentials of education research itself. I think such exclusions are unfortunate, and I want to illustrate how we could push further in our efforts to understand education in late modernity. In essence, what I want to argue is that policy work is actually very messy. The impulse to macro-level explanation, which is perhaps the preferred approach in global education policy studies, undervalues the new imaginaries of self-presentation that characterize what Arjuna Padarai long ago called the global cultural economy. Here I suggest that tropes such as quality, commercialization, privatization, and for example, entrepreneurship intersect with and invest other tropes such as freedom and self-determination, fulfillment, happiness, style, love, belonging, as well as anger and disillusionment. In short, I think there's much of value to consider what a Padarai called the unwieldy and disjunctive nature of contemporary global flows of ideas and emotions. What looks like the capture of public education by elite or vested interests, a key fixation within policy studies, is actually much more a chaotic ensemble of reason, desire, fear, and seduction. So before I unfold this argument, I want to just give you an illustration of how one of my own earlier studies could be read within the genre of global education policy research. About 10 years ago, with a colleague Min Bahadur Bista from Nepal, we crafted a genealogy of education reform in Nepal since the introduction of Education for All in 1991. Here we outlined a narrowing of reform goals via 3 distinct policy moments that provided one explanation for the desired policy solution of community-managed schooling that aimed to set schools free from state control. However, almost as soon as we were finished with that work, another phase of reform commenced, this time driven by new actors to the sector. It seemed that what had started as a firm, even universal commitment to free public education had in a very short time transformed into something quite different. And it seemed depressingly so. So, and I think this is my main departure point for my talk. Is the important story in that time, where the only update has been over the last 10 years the introduction of big business into the sector. For example, working through technologies such as second wave low-fee schools, teach for all type schemes, and entrepreneurial networks. Is it really the case that we should limit ourselves to tracing political and economic interests, for example, people, policy, and money, that take material forms? Who then becomes visible, and who and what disappears into the shadows to become what anthropologist James Ferguson called noise? And then finally, when global education scholars talk about flows of ideas, how far can we push what counts as an idea? For example, how do wild dreams and associations invest private solutions in education with legitimacy, especially as meaning systems in late modernity start to break down? So let me return to Nepal for just one moment. Running alongside emerging private initiatives in education are a range of imaginaries that are only partly grounded in any lived experience of life in Nepal. And I've got 3 slides here just to give you an idea of the type of visual inspirations people get in Nepal to imagine what life might look like. The spirit of Muhammad Yunus permeates the global south, as many of you know, especially his appeal, one might say through the voice of Kant, that we shed our self-imposed immaturity. Bill Gates is a common face on the walls and doors of low-fee schools, this one from a school in the west of Nepal. And his call is much less sympathetic. It's, yes, find yourself, but live in shame if you don't. Such direct messages are often seasoned with much more baroque ones. So here we have a photo I took in Kathmandu of Indian models advertising Scotch whisky outside a Kathmandu cafe called Paris. And that suggests both cosmopolitan sophistication, but also the subaltern in ontological trouble. So there are a myriad of issues here, but for me the urgent question is, how do subjects exchange all of this in semiotic terms in the quest to live a life worth living? Subjectivity is made in contexts that are both firm and imaginary. In Nepal, I would argue, as elsewhere, that could include any of the following. This is a picture from Dubai. Some 1,500 young Nepalis have their work permits to the Gulf approved every day. For many, the Gulf represents the end of a yellow brick road. Here, young Nepalis dream of experiencing what they call Dubai style, a form of cultural engagement built on imaginings of fashion, wealth, cosmopolitanism, liberal attitudes, and consumer freedom. Unfortunately, as we well know, the reality of most of those work permits is a form of modern slavery. Here, the Gulf is lived as nightmare, and a nightmare ensemble of opportunity, which is usually unrealized, and then disappointment, which needs to be addressed when they return back home. However, once the dream slips out of reach, it doesn't just disappear, rather it latches onto new objects and seductions. I once met a young Nepali who'd recently returned from 30 months in the Gulf. In that time, in those 30 months, he earned $3,600, was never allowed to leave the building site where he was working. He was eventually injured and had to return home to Nepal disabled. And when he got home, his wife and child and the money was gone. And that was quite a typical story for many migrant workers who spent a long time away, that their lives unraveled in the time they were gone. And I remember trying to empathize with him, saying how difficult and awkward that must have been, and terrible, what a terrible story. But he actually said it wasn't all bad, and he'd learnt a lot during his time in the Gulf. He was socialized in Nepal during the Maoist uprising, so he had a political language as well. But he was quite clear that the crude sort of capitalism one found in the Gulf was actually an improvement on the feudalism of Nepal. He thought that the Gulf had turned out to be a dream, but that awakened him to what he called the lie of Nepal. Ultimately, he said, what he'd learnt in the Gulf is that there is no one else but myself, and if I need to make a society, I have to do it with my closest friends, but the state is not the solution. And the undertext for all of this was the sense that education had prepared young people in Nepal for nothing other than slavery. So the fixation to maintain and protect education for all, for him at least, was a false dream. So I would contend that spaces such as Dubai or the Gulf, and the experience of disappointment and exploitation in general, is one important driver of private solutions in education in Nepal. Here as elsewhere in the so-called Global South, unfulfilled desires are transferred into other spheres. However, that type of insight or analytic connection is largely lacking in global education policy studies, which by contrast are often content to explore major literature themes such as reclaiming the state, ensuring social justice, and securing equity and so forth. Perhaps due to the complexity of things, possibly out of cynicism, or simply to feed our indignation, such approaches often move too quickly towards rounding up the usual suspects. So I have some challenges here that will be the point of departure for the final part of my talk. How does global education policy science deal with what effects theorists would call sites of misidentification or cruel attachments? How can policy research do justice to unwieldy flows? Is disjuncture in policy research something to be resolved, ignored, or embraced? Could it be that the type of disjuncture hinted at here is actually the other of global education policy science, by which I mean the things that can't be processed with reason, but which must then thus remain suppressed to haunt our analyses? So I won't go into the long heritage of otherness or alterity in philosophy or sociology, but I note that it's often marginal to global policy studies. One way to deal with global complexity is through network analysis, which is becoming more popular as an approach to policy science work. The ambition to clarify relations and interests is far clearer here than in my own Policyscapes approach to global policy reform, seductively so. At a seminar a few weeks ago, Stephen Ball talked about his recent network ethnography of Indian education reform, a type of ethnography without ethnos, to draw on Gupta and Ferguson's work. When offering this remarkable image of the network, the suggestion was that such analysis can unravel the complexity of reform, or at least make it visible. It can also be read as the first step towards a politics of intervention. Whilst Ball himself in the seminar called it a beautiful image and a work of art, he also thought it was something that you can't easily read. But I'm not so sure, and immediately when I saw this image, and you can't see the lines in the image, can you? There's a range of lines connecting a particular point. Do they come through in the slide? That's strange. The point was all these lines are going all places, but they all lead to one place, and that's a particular entrepreneur. But I think there are other ways to read that picture to get an insight into the state of policy studies. Most of you will recognize that image. That's a labyrinth, and that comes to us from Greek mythology. So let me try and unfold my understanding of that. The labyrinth in Greek mythology was built for King Minos of Crete to hold in the Minotaur, which was a mythical beast. Each year that beast required a sacrifice, and that sacrifice became more and more unbearable for the citizens of the city. Ultimately, the beast was killed by a hero called Theseus, and he went into the labyrinth, killed the beast, and came out again. The only way he had the courage to go into the labyrinth was to have a piece of string tied around his body from the outside so that he could navigate his way into the enclosure and find his way back out again. So let me try and stretch that imagery for just a moment and consider these parallels when we do policy work. The labyrinth may well be the impossible complexity of human and non-human relations in global education policy spaces. The Minotaur could easily be the villain of global education reform. For example, with low-fee schools, that's someone like James Tooley. Andreas Schlechter from the OECD is the nightmare of most European policy analysts. And Bill and Melinda Gates have become recent targets. And the hero, Theseus, well, that could be theory, it could be method, it could be data, but it could also be the policy scholar. And finally, the string. To me, the string is the narrative of meaning and coherence that we always seek before setting off on perilous journeys. The string is our storyline from start to finish, from good to bad and back again, from reason through chaos and back to the world. The string ties us to the world and stops us from getting lost. Narrative has a beginning, a complication, and an end. This line of thinking is central to Mark C. Taylor's wonderful reworking of Derridean deconstruction in his book Airing, which is now quite old, I think from the early 80s. In some sense, it's about what Paddy Lather once called the science possible after our disappointments with science, but I think he goes much further. Airing is framed around 4 precarious domains that are central to modern science, including much of what we do in comparative and international education: God, the self, history, and book. In the age of innocence, these were brought to life in uppercase as authoritative, certain, and confident. In our current age of loss, Taylor suggests that a new mode of knowing becomes possible when we rethink them in lowercase. Such insight is obvious to post-foundational scholars who revel in the various deaths of God and his proxies, the self and the author, and all meaning-making projects that attempt to enshrine themselves in an authoritative text. We also know it from anthropology, particularly the literary turn and Clifford and Marcus's writing culture. Their insight was that qualitative research, all qualitative research, is caught up in the invention, not the representation of culture. Thus, rather than a radical text undermining all we know and hold dear, Airing is actually a very familiar story, reminding us of our provisional and fragile position as transcendent author, creator, and master, and how we constantly invent reason through the text. Ultimately, what Taylor is talking about here is the possibility and necessity of a different relation to writing. For Taylor, in the wake of these deaths, it's through writing that we have a chance to experiment, experience, understand, and think afresh. That to me is a welcome message for a field or a subfield that's moving with great confidence in a singular direction. Instead of the labyrinth, Taylor offers the image of a maze, which is a heuristic implying multiple possibilities to transverse, explore, and experience research as both journey and outcome. Ultimately, that's about sacrificing one's expertise as authoritative author, forgoing or at least complicating representational projects, and letting the reader find his or her own path to awareness. It's less a path to giving voices to others, for example, the poor who find themselves at the bottom of the global educational food chain, and much more about taking it away from the types of authors we're encouraged and rewarded for becoming. As I see it then, the challenge is to keep all of these imaginaries in the picture. They include particular policy ideals, technologies, and dramas, certain neoliberal villains, nodal points and events, and deep, disturbing, and disjunctive insights that can't or won't be silenced or resolved. As well, finally, as a type of joyful and trusting fatalism, or at the very least a letting go. That could easily embody the spirit of Nietzsche's Dionysus, disrupting and unraveling taken for granted narratives of cause and effect in education. For others, it might just be the courage to experiment with policy research as a type of open-ended wandering. Either way, these are forms of inclusion that could only enrich our field.
Good afternoon. Thank you for being here on this beautiful Atlanta afternoon. And I want to say thanks to Noah for arranging all of these problematizing sessions. I think it's a really interesting and inspiring generative format for our discussions together today. I also want to say thanks to the tech folks over here. When the tech folks are doing their job perfectly, they are most invisible. So thank you for that. They're capturing this, it's being live streamed, and also will be available, probably published soon. All right. I have a simple, structured talk today. Want to start off, I will posit that for all theories and attempts at inclusion, exclusion is inevitable, and sometimes exclusion is also desirable. So I'm just going to posit that, and if you want to argue that that's not the case, let's meet for a drink afterwards. Okay. So given that posit, I will ask in this presentation two things. what are some of the mechanisms of inclusion-exclusion that shape current thinking, and how might it be possible to think otherwise about mechanisms of inclusion-exclusion? In other words, the question is not whether we have inclusion-exclusion or what kind of inclusion-exclusion is best, but the question for me today is how? How do we have inclusion and exclusion? One of the mechanisms of inclusion-exclusion is classification schemes and categories. I think many of you are familiar with this list. You probably encountered it in Foucault's The Order of Things. He took it from Jorge Luis Borges' work, who took it from John Wilkins. This is from the Celestial Emporium of Benevolent Knowledge, attributed to John Wilkins. When we look at this classification from our present sensibilities, it feels incoherent. It feels as if it were uninformed, as if it were somehow naive or an unsophisticated way of drawing classifications. After all, some of the categories are identity-based, other categories are place-based, some categories are time-passing, other categories are dependent on a previous event. So they look to us as if it were wrong or incoherent, uninformed. I'd like to suggest another classification for people that I will say is similarly incoherent. It's an epistemological mishmash. Because some of these categories are identity-based, some of them are history-based, some of them are based on an event that just happened, some are based on systems of desire, some to genetics, but they are not parallel. The point of this comparison is to say familiarity creates the illusion of coherence. This is, I think, related to Antonio Novoa's wonderful talk yesterday when he was addressing illusions of illusions, which are delusions. So this is one of the mechanisms by which inclusion and exclusion take place, is the generation of systems, classification schemes and categories that are lent coherence by historical familiarity. In addition, another mechanism are the ranking, systems of hierarchy and ranked categories. So the classifications and systems and categories are products of power relations. I want to illustrate this with just a brief statement about the history of the bell curve, which some of you know I've done some work on. Many people in the social sciences tend to assume that the bell curve distribution is a product of inference from empirical data. And that that's why we repeat it in testing and distribution models. But the history of the bell curve actually suggests something entirely otherwise. That in the 1830s and 40s, most notably in the work of Belgian astronomer Adolphe Quetelet, who believed that a God-created universe would be symmetrical, and believed then that the job of statisticians was to create categories and measurements that made the symmetry of the world apparent. So, the bell curve came first, and the categories came after that as products of particular historical ethos at the time. And I am putting forth here now that that is true for all of our categories and classification systems. Those categories and our preconceived notions, our historical ethos, influences from many sectors, reproduce one another. But there are alternatives, and then in the second part of this talk, I would like to just gesture to 3 alternatives that, at least for me, have helped to generate a way out of our current locked-in reproductive systems of inclusion-exclusion based on classification schemas. The first of those is intersectionality. Intersectionality was coined by Columbia law professor Kimberly Crenshaw, actually in her book in 1989, but has recently become much more active a lot in feminist discourses. Professor Crenshaw was a member of Anita Hill's legal defense team. For those of you who remember, in the United States in 1991, Clarence Thomas was nominated and was being reviewed by the United States Senate Judiciary Committee for a seat on the Supreme Court, and Anita Hill raised accusations of sexual harassment. Professor Crenshaw was caught in the middle of discourses about race and discourses about gender, and since that time worked really some elegant theorizations on why the intersections of systems of oppression need our attention, and that can, if we fail to note intersections, then either our racial identities or our gender identities or our class identities become not visible in discussions of privilege and oppression. So intersectionality is one of the theories that offers an alternative that helps us problematize conventions of inclusion and exclusion. A second set of theories that has been very helpful to me for providing some alternatives was actually mentioned by my previous speaker, Stephen, who also quoted Nigel Thrift. These are non-representational theories. Non-representational theories were generated, have been from geography departments in the UK, many, many universities in the UK, and out of cultural geography. And although I haven't heard this written, it is my speculation that the geographers who are attempting to map our everyday life have tried to figure out a way we can take into account our virtual lives, our physical lives, our memories, our aspirations as part of the cultural landscape. So if we wanted to describe what's going on in this room, there's the sound of my voice, there's the visuals of the slides, there are people who are thinking about where they're going after the session. There are people who are texting other people on other continents. There are people who just got some news from a family member that is distracting attention one way or another. All of these things are part of this room, part of our experience, part of what we are all living through at the moment. And it is only because of conventional classification schemes, such as the ones I showed in the previous slide, that censor some of those facets of our experience and only allow us to speak about or communicate another set, which is put together according to conventional notions of coherence. The key terms for non-representational theory are affect and I actually think this works better in French. Expérience works, I think, is better in the non-representational sense because the French term means both experience and experiment. So the sense of the non-representational theory then is to disable autopilot. Autopilot is what allows us to see coherence in our assumed classification systems, allows us to censor some things and include other things as we describe what's going on in a room. NRT is the other generative source of alternatives to inclusion, exclusion. The third and last source that I would like to mention is dissensus, which I know primarily from Jacques Rancière. The book is Dissensus. Some of you know Jacques Rancière's work from The Ignorant Schoolmaster. An important part of this philosophy is that Rancière tells us that politics is the opposite of policing. Policing is the state of consensus. So, for example, when we recognize the list of classifications, age, gender, race, like this, we have made a collective consensus about what matters and what does not matter. Rancière says, we thereby reiterating that, we police ourselves and we police our thinking, and suggests that the way toward equality then is politics, which is based on dissensus. So I'll read these two quotations. The essence of politics is the manifestation of dissensus as the presence of two worlds in one. I think that that pertains to the world that we assume to be our publicly agreed upon world, our consensus world, and the world that we are experiencing ourselves. Probably other ways to interpret that. Consensus consists in the reduction of politics to the police. Consensus is the end of politics. And equality relies on dissensus, the commensurability of the incommensurables. The list of, from the classification schemes, incommensurable things that are commensurable in some ways. How does inclusion and exclusion relate to radical equality? Radical equality is one of Rancière's major contributions to our philosophical work. He asserts that because resources in the world are unequally distributed, because systems of oppression give us unequal distribution, the step of equality is to assume equality between people from the beginning. That is, not to wait until the revolution before we treat each other as equal human beings. All right, I'll just wrap up here, the summary of what I've done so far. Classification schemes feel coherent when they're familiar, even when they're constituted as an epistemological hodgepodge. Categories, classification schemes, and hierarchies are generated by historically specific power relations. The intersections among categories may generate insights that are not yielded by comparisons among discrete familiar categories. And finally, theories of intersectionality, non-representation, and dissensus offer alternatives to existing systems of thought and thereby help us to problematize inclusion and exclusion in the service of equality.
Hi, everyone. So I don't have any PowerPoint, so you'll have to pay attention to me. First of all, thank you, Noah, for organizing this. I'm very honored to be in this panel. And since this is being recorded, I want to state that this was the best CIES conference I've ever attended. So thank you. I would also like to acknowledge that many of the ideas that I'm going to present came out from conversations that I had with doctoral students Seth McCall and Jordan Courson. All right. In his influential essay, The University Well Conditioned, Derrida states that, and I quote, "The university demands and ought to be granted in principle, besides what is called academic freedom, an unconditional freedom to question and to assert, or even, going still further, the right to say publicly all that is required by research, knowledge, and thought concerning the truth. He continues, the university should thus also be the place in which nothing is beyond question, not even the current and determined figure of democracy, not even the traditional idea of critique, meaning theoretical critique, and not even the authority of the question form of thinking as questioning. While he says that the university-wide condition does not in fact exist, his essay expands on the idea that this is the mission of the new humanities in the university to come. I will not delve here into Derrida's work on the new humanities, but will instead use Derrida's own tools and those of others involved in what Blanco and Piran call the spectral turn, to flip the idea of the university implied in the university-wide condition. I mobilize the specter as a conceptual metaphor, an analytical tool that performs theoretical work, that does theory. The goal will be to reconsider the ways in which the exclusions embedded in the unconditional university specter its project. A different reading of this project through a problematization of inclusion and exclusion may hopefully lead to a rethinking of the mission of the university to come. But I'm not going to do this only in abstract, so I'm going to do a little shifting gears here. And I'm going to talk a bit about the higher ed landscape in Argentina. In some ways, this higher ed landscape can be said to reflect both local histories and idiosyncrasies, as well as some global trends and deep linkages to Western European universities. For instance, while higher ed enrollment has been steadily growing, by 2010, that's when the last census was taken, only 6.4% of the population over 20 years old had finished college. In a country in which there is a very strong public, and in Argentina public means free, university system, this relatively low completion rate can be attributed to a multiplicity of variables, but it begs the question of the relation between public education understood as a right that is free, for the most part without an entrance examination, and with the only formal prerequisite being a high school degree, and the continuous exclusion of the vast majority of the population. So in order to address this issue, many different strategies have been put in place. One of these strategies has been the founding in the last 2 decades of 23 new public universities, 10 in the first half of the 90s and 13 in the 2000s. I'll focus here on the first batch of those 10, which were founded, like I said, in the 90s during Carlos Menem's administration, which is widely regarded as a right-leaning neoliberal government. So out of these 10 universities, 6 were created in the area surrounding the city of Buenos Aires. And these foundations are seen by many, were seen at that time by many critical scholars as an attempt at diminishing the weight of the University of Buenos Aires, then run by the oppositional party, and responding to calls by leaders of the party ruling those areas to gain a university in a territory. So here, a little bit of context. The University of Buenos Aires is a massive university that has over 250,000 students in the city of Buenos Aires. Like I said, it's free, and it's traditionally been the site in which most of the intellectual elite that has been critical to all of this government has been educated. It has been a hub of critical thought. So that's why the idea that founding these other universities in the surrounding areas was an attempt to decenter the power of the university by tempting people to go to closer universities that would offer shorter careers of lower quality. So that was the original reading of the foundation of the universities. But these new universities, while criticized for the alleged intention of the president for founding them, appropriated a trope of innovation differently in different locales. The 6 universities in the periphery of Buenos Aires, by being located in areas in which quality public universities seemed unthinkable until then, were forced to reconsider what they were there for. So very quickly, they started to question the tension between quality and access, and the idea that an increase in opportunities would lead linearly to a more democratic system. I'm going to go deeper into one of those universities, which is the Universidad Nacional General Sarmiento. To give you an idea, this university is located about an hour away from the city, in an area in which 90% of the students' parents had never attended college, and more than 70% of those parents had not even finished high school. Roberto Domecq, the university's first dean that served between 94 and 98, stated that some people sought, and I quote, a poor university for poor people. But our position was that if the population was poor youth, even more reason to give them the best possible education, thus going against the idea of short vocational careers directed to the job market. He said, the fact that there had been no other universities in the area gave us great liberty to think about the structure, meaning and goals of the university. It was an invitation to innovate. According to him and some other people that were interviewed, the main innovation of this university had to do with the organization of the university around centers, responding to themes and problems instead of around traditional schools. So this led to more interdisciplinarity, team-based work, grounded on understanding deep issues instead of granting skills. For example, one of the main centers was the Center for Urban Ecology that was addressing the issue of the low quality of water and soil in the area due to industrialization. The third dean, Silvia Feldman, between 2002 and 2010 said, and I quote, learning to side with those coming from different generational and cultural experiences is great learning. To think and act based on understanding the other's complexity implies a change in mentality that involves laborious learning and effort. It requires inquisitive thinking, since the transformation directed towards access to rights, to assume those rights, is a complex process both for the one accessing them, as well as for the institution that opens up a space for it to happen. This takes time, work, and the capacity to listen in an open, critical, and inquisitive manner, being able to be shaken out of one's own certainties, end of quote. Some other initiatives in this direction were the creation of scholarships to cover transportation and bibliography. Again, there's no tuition. The publishing of cheap reading guides, having some childcare on site, multi-age playrooms, and artistic and cultural activities for everyone in the community. This is all based on the basic assumption of higher education as a human right, as a social public good. In some ways, one could argue that the university as a human right is the university without condition, and the university cannot be without condition unless it is a human right. According to this reading, the university as an idea overflows the alleged intentions of this specific institution's concrete foundation, remember, to disperse the power of the University of Buenos Aires, a combination of the intentions of the leadership team, a historical, cultural, idiosyncratic understanding of education as a right that is deeply embedded in Argentine society, and a change in the direction of the government starting in 2003 that allocated much more funding to public institutions, created the conditions for a more inclusive university. This inclusivity was almost already there in the idea of the university, but a combination of policy and circumstance allowed it to flourish. So I do not mean to completely challenge that reading here. These universities did interrupt the normal flow by situating themselves where they were not supposed to, by offering possibilities that were not supposed to be offered, by being inhabited by people who were not supposed to be there. In the most important ways, due to how young these institutions are, the full impact of their establishment and work will only be able to be assessed in the decades to come. That is, if the current administration does not completely destroy them. So this work, my paper here, is not to be read as a critique of these universities, which I think are doing very important good work. However, there's another complementary reading that I want to offer. When the person doing the interviews in the book that interviews the three deans asks the first dean, Domecq, about the quality of graduates, given that the former dean kept teaching there, he answered, the work presented by students was very diverse. There were weaknesses. There has not been good training on giving students tools to express themselves correctly. They had difficulties with this, but they also had enormous will to work and be of use. We needed to overcome many obstacles: lack of experience with expression, methodological weaknesses, bibliographical excess and difficulties metabolizing it, etc. On the other hand, there was creativity, intuition, knowledge about reality, end of quote. When discussing some of the issues he faced, José Luis Coragio, the second dean, acknowledged that fields of study such as urban ecology, and I quote, did not work because they did not reach the parents' and students' imaginaries. They should have called it architecture. Whatever is different is not recognized as an alternative, end of quote. In this sense, one thing that surprised everyone involved in Universidad Nacional General Sarmiento is the area that, as of a few years, comprised 40% of the student body and graduates: education. When asked about how he made sense of this, the third dean, Silvio Feldman, said, "Teaching is closer to the social world of students. Sometimes some of the degrees offered by the university were not sufficiently integrated and legitimated by the knowledge and experiences brought in by students." The reading I'm proposing is an invitation to consider what is spectering the idea of the university and how even the call for a university-wide condition, the notion of a place in which nothing is beyond question, is spectered by its own limitations. So, as I said before, Blanco and Piron discussed the notion of the spectre as an analytical tool that does theory. They considered Derrida's publication of Spectres of Marx in '93 as a catalyst for the spectral turn. Openness to spectrality for Derrida implies a scholar, and I quote, "capable beyond the opposition between presence and non-presence, actuality and inactuality, life and non-life, of thinking the possibility of the spectre as possibility." He uses the figure of Derrida uses the figure of the ghost to pursue, without ever apprehending, that which haunts like a ghost, and by way of this haunting demands justice or at least a response. In looking at the foundation and workings of the new batch of universities, and especially of General Sarmiento, a consideration of some of the specters haunting it might be useful in understanding its limits, and one possible way in which inclusion and exclusion are not only deeply intertwined, but also not the results of policy, but of unpredictable interruptions. So let me go through three specters that haunt General Sarmiento. The first specter is the ghost of those excluded from the university space, those whose absence is a presence demanding a response. The potentiality of total inclusion of a university that actualizes the right to education for everyone does something to the university and its workings. It urges the search for ways to fulfill that potentiality. It moves resources and bodies, it centers some strategies and marginalizes others. The necessary failing that it entails haunts both the idea of the university and the existence of this specific university. The very word university contains the universe it claims to encompass. While the universe tends to be framed as the universe of knowledge, an unconditional approach to knowledge maybe, it would not be hard to argue that that universe can only be reached by universal inclusion of knowers. This impossibility haunts the idea of the university as experienced by any person attempting to construct a syllabus, delimit a field of study, programs, and paths, but it's also more than that. The specter of universality actively undoes the seeming tension between theory and practice, between the demands of the labor market and the desires of something else, by silently screaming at the university, "We are everything. We are everyone." Going back to the specific case of General Sarmiento, when Domecq discusses the obstacles he sees in the students' productions, opposing them to strength, creativity, intuition, knowledge, or reality, one can sense the ghost of those not creative or intuitive enough, as they are seen as unable to enter even the conversation. Yet they keep knocking on the gates of the university that has effectively interrupted the normal flow by opening doors that had always been closed, even as those doors are always already framed by walls. The second specter is that of the model university, the one they are trying to distinguish themselves from, in this case, the University of Buenos Aires. When Coraje explains the difficulties of new careers to enter the population's imaginary, or when Feldman expresses the surprise while proposing reasons for why education became such a large part of the university, the University of Buenos Aires' voice returns to state, "You are not like me. You are not a real university. Your standards are not like ours. Your students are not like mine." Both the innovations and the obstacles faced by General Sarmiento are always in relation to the absence of University of Buenos Aires in that space. The University of Buenos Aires' failure to fulfill its promise of universality is what opens the door for an institution such as General Sarmiento to include that which has been excluded. Thus, the University of Buenos Aires has already defined the terms of inclusion and exclusion, of failure and success. The third specter is that of the land the university is occupying, an unproductive, contaminated, proto-flooding terrain with layers upon layers of history. I will not delve here in the complex history of urbanization in Buenos Aires, but will refer simply to the juxtaposition between a modern set of buildings, including a state-of-the-art auditorium unlike any I had ever seen outside commercial theater, and the splash of my boots as they sank deeper into the mud after a heavy rain. As if the land itself was screaming for recognition, resisting and acting upon a university set on disrupting its unproductivity. The university web condition is haunted, and there is no exorcism that will be able to remove the specters that call for it to do the impossible while setting it up to fail. Derrida's call for the university to the place where nothing is beyond question is, in this sense, limited by a focus on the presence of those questions, by the inclusion of everything that is perceived to be an interrogation. The idea of the university must pay attention to the affects and the effects of the ghosts that haunt it, the specters of ways of being outside its universe, the shimmering materiality of the land in which it is emplaced, and the absent bodies that interrupt its efforts to include them by asking, but weren't we part of you already? Thank you.
So we have plenty of time for Q&A. And so what I would encourage us is if we could get like a set of 3 or 4 questions, and then we can have the panelists respond to them. So questions, and we have the mics.
Well, I'll start off with one for Steve. You know, one of the things that I thought was interesting across the 2 other papers was, you know, the way a notion of the potentiality of total inclusion kind of urges a search to realize that potentiality. And I was just curious in your thoughts about the way that might be reflected in comparative and international education, whether you see that potentiality driving things. But we're going to collect a couple of others too.
Yeah, that'd be great.
I also liked very much the idea of, and I would like to understand more, to see more clearly, of capitalism as an improvement over feudalism. One of your, was it ironic, or was it really, it was something like the actor believed into it. And linked to that, for instance, I'm always thinking if neoliberal, this is also a question for you since you deal with universities, are neoliberal some sort of solutions, management-oriented, can be seen in different ways in different contexts, because you can have maybe universities characterized by corruption or not merit or political clientelism or whatever. And sometimes you may have actors thinking that maybe neoliberal solutions may be something like an improvement over the previous state of whatever it was. So.
Question for Lynn, just to make sure everyone gets a question. Yeah.
Thank you. Yes, I have one question for Professor Fender. I was very impressed by, I think it was the first slide where we had 2 orders of concepts. One was the famous list by Borges, and the other one a list of, let's say, historical terms concerning or involved somehow with the exclusion or inclusion. But don't you think that the second list, in the second list behind any of those names, there is something embodied in terms of history? If I'm not wrong, there was social class, and I immediately thought of E.P. Thompson, The Making of the English Working Class. Yes, of course, he uses the word making, but there are events behind that, plenty of events, and I don't think that the coherence concerning those events was invented by E.P. Thompson. Some of them actually concern groups of people acting together on very long periods of history. So if you could clarify better this idea that the second list was the result of a conventional illusion as much as the first list was. Thank you very much.
Great. I think we have now a set of questions that we can start with. So, Stephen, did you want to go first?
Yeah, I can go. Can you hear me? No? I always ask because usually I start my answers and no one can hear. So. Okay. Maybe I should just start with Monica's question first because I think that man was the man I was talking about. He was being truthful and politically aware, but also ironic, and also turning my interest in him as a sort of a poor subject back onto me, you know, making me see things are not as simple. But he used this word capitalism and feudalism, but I think the example he gave, which shocked me at the time, was that he thought in the Gulf states, employers had concern for their workers, because and I think the example he gave was that once an hour they were forced to drink a bottle of water so they wouldn't die, you know, because the conditions were just so terrible. But he said in Nepal you could drop dead in a field from work and no one would even pick up your body. So at least when there was a profit motive and someone was exploiting you, they had interests. And that was his way to say that in Nepal was a long way from being any sort of a society where the state was in a position to either see people and then treat them seriously. So I think that was his main point there. He also said, and there's a million stories about this from the Gulf, but it really struck me that because Nepal, in geopolitical terms, is a very weak country, the Nepali ambassador would never go out to the building sites and represent Nepali workers when they died. But the ambassador from the Philippines, which is a country with a different set of relations in geopolitical terms, that man was very militant. You know, so he would actually, the ambassador would go to the construction sites and want to talk to the building foreman to represent all the workers' interests, because, you know, Filipino workers were a big segment, and they just had a different relation, a different understanding of their role as a diplomatic body. So that really struck me that Nepal was really abject in a way, just completely outside this system of care, right? And he used the word feudal. In relation to Noah's question, I mean, that's a tricky one. When you started talking, I immediately thought of Jürgen Schriever's book from maybe 15 years ago about discourse formation in comparative education. And many of you probably don't know that book, but we all know that academics have interests in forming discourses around their particular bodies of knowledge. Of course, that's what humans do. And in comparative education, it's just we know that from our history, at least since the early 80s, it's been difficult to get counter discourses to what you could crudely call a modernist way of looking upon education, and then the role of science or comparative science in improving education. So I don't know. I mean, on the one hand, we have, it seems to me that comparative education is, even though many of the colleagues here intersect with other academic communities, there's something quite distinctive about Anglo-American comparative and international education. You know, and many of these good colleagues come in and out of this field, but they have their homes elsewhere. So I think the center of gravity here is, you know, in some way, well, I'd be a bit careful with the descriptors, but I don't think it's a field that is interested as much in pushing what counts as knowledge. It's very interested in adding more knowledge, but not pushing frameworks. So I think in this field, it's more difficult to find a space for transgressive social science or humanities-based social science. But on the other hand, you know, even though there was a struggle, we developed a special interest group devoted to post-foundational social science So there is a space, but I think I wouldn't hold out much hope for comparative and international education being at the forefront of theory development. It's a field really that's aimed, that tends to bring together knowledge and apply it, and that's the logic that drives a lot of the work here.
Danny?
So, if I understood your question correctly, we're asking if could, in different contexts, for example, a neoliberal university be a solution or an improvement over other things, right? I've been thinking a lot about Antonio Novoa's lecture yesterday. And it's interesting because I had my little talk written before that. But I think the question of whether something is an improvement over something else is a question of time. And I think the idea of specters, then it's a question about temporalities. If one follows Antonio's reflection from yesterday, right? So what the difference is, in time, you have a linear progression in which you have a problem, and you have an improvement that generates a new problem. There's another, and so there's a linear progression of, in this case, the university work. But I think the question of what are the specters that haunt the university looks at time differently. So it's not a question of whether this is an improvement over other universities. Like I said before, it's not an attempt to critique. I think what they are doing is it's really good work in the university. But by asking all the specters that haunt the idea of university in general and the specific university are sort of looking at the resonances of different ways in which we have been thinking of the university and how even the attempts to do improvements are haunted by these specters and are limited by the ways in which we're thinking. So this attempt to fulfill the potentiality of total inclusion, in that point I agree 100% with Lynn, like inclusion and exclusion are not two things that you can separate. Right? The moment you include, you're setting a limit, another boundary on who is excluded, and that has historical resonances and echoes and specters. So I think the idea of whether this is an improvement or not, it sort of follows a different path than the one I'm trying to work on.
Okay, I'll just build from my two colleagues, Stephen and Danny's talks here. Does the potentiality of full inclusion drive work in comparative ed? I do have the sense that inclusion has a normative spin and that it's associated with assumptions of progress. But just as Danny was saying, progress is a problem. You probably know Robert Nisbet's The History of the Idea of Progress, where progress doesn't even mean the same thing from period to period, right? One of the things that I learned from mostly from the people that I work with, is assumptions of progress very often tend to be based on the experiences of the privileged few, and that things that are better for them, like the stock market going up, if that's regarded as progress, it's not really reflective of many people, probably most people. So narratives of progress, I think, are extremely problematic, and I do recommend Nisbet's work on the history of the idea of progress for that. Maybe I can I'm sorry, I don't know your name. You asked the question about the categorization schemes. Yeah? Sorry. Anselmo, thank you very much. All right. Yeah, that's an interesting question, and I completely agree with you that every term on that second list has a history. And from one point of view, we can see that the generation of those terms are shaped by ethos of modernity, science, identity politics, and in that way, we can see them as reflective of particular historical ethos. At the same time, those histories of those terms are not parallel, right? They have their own separate histories. Histories of religion may intersect at spaces with histories of sexuality, but recent science work on chromosomes has affected theories of sexuality that has no effect on religious identities, for example, or may have no effect on that. So I think that there's the point of the comparison was to show that each of those terms that we tend to take for granted as a system of classification that makes sense are actually as epistemologically diverse as the first list. The first list evidently is fictitious, but if it had not been, it's possible that there would have been a history of each of those terms that would similarly run parallel to the one. I don't know if I answered.
By a writer, having been written by a writer, I think that the first list is probably more coherent than the second because it stems from the imagination of a novelist. Then
Makes my point. Right.
Hi, thank you very much for your talks. I'm interested in analytic potential of particularly non-representational methodologies and theories in ed policy research. And I think my question is kind of a practical one. If you have, or you can think of any examples in which this type of research is informing policy making in education.
I would need to think about that for a moment, and I guess that's part of my point and my sort of desperation. Because you know, and maybe, do you have a, because?
To start with this, I will draw from Robert Cowan's talk yesterday, where he distinguished applied research from scientific research. And I'm not sure NRT has any intentions of informing educational policy. I'm also not sure if the discourses of educational policy would have any interest in, or consideration for any non-representational theories. I tend to think for the most part educational policy discourses operate in their own spheres with their own sets of interest, with their own conjoining nodes of purpose. I'm not very optimistic, or maybe even find it desirable to think that one would inform the other.
But having said that, I think a big part of my point was that when I present these things, or I present my comparative research to, is that working? You see? Yeah, I think a big part of my point has come out of my experience where we're talking about non-representational comparative research gets very quickly closed down as its opposite. You know, so we know from development studies, I still remember when I started reading post-structuralism through development studies, Arturo Escobar had a section in his book, Encountering Development, about the genius of development being a field where you couldn't make critique without coming with an alternative, because then you were seen as irresponsible or worse. You know, so the field was structured around like a gambling thing. You had to put your money down before you were allowed to speak. And I feel that's the case in much policy science, that people will treat what I say as an ornament, something that's interesting, and there should always be space for maybe a chapter in a book at the end, just to let people know that it's also a rich field. But from my perspective, I think when I'm teaching as well, I want students to understand that these things are the other of policy science. You know, we know that policy science, every generation comes with a raft of suggestions and ideas and theories, and then they're usually discounted and another set start. And the logic is that those theories were just not quite right, so we come with others. But there's always some absence or otherness in all of these theoretical and practical moves. So I think policy science would be better if it was open to this otherness. It was slower to reach conclusions and more encompassing about what it looked at when it was doing research. So often I think that there's a deliberate strategy to position what I would be saying as a poor alternative rather than the other that's already built into the mainstream. but people have interests in both including and excluding certain types of ideas.
Questions? There's one right
there. My first question goes to Professor Stephen Carney. My respect, Professor. This year is the 200th anniversary of comparative ed. During the past 2 centuries, comparative education developed, with challenges and also with some rapid developments. What do you think of the third 100 years, especially in the near future of the future of comparative ed? My second question goes to Daniel. Yes, professor from TC. You talk about the idea of the university. Recent years, there are a lot of hot topics, such as entrepreneurial university, public management, and academic capitalism. And there are a lot of discussions and disputes about the impact of these ideas on the idea of the university. And what do you think of their influence? I'm sorry, I didn't introduce myself. I'm Liu Bosen from Beijing Normal University. Thank you.
Let me start at least. That's sort of the, what do you call that? In British English, it's the chestnut. The old chestnut is the great question, what's the future? And I don't know whether this is the same question in educational sociology or in anatomy or another field, that every few years in comparative education we have to think about what is the future and where are we going. That to me is symptomatic of a crisis. I once got in trouble, and I guess I shouldn't say it, but I started an article by saying comparative education has never been more popular and it's never had less to say, in a sense, in that we know from international assessments and PISA and TIMSS and so forth, the impulse to compare has just escaped, it's proliferated wildly. And the more we compare, the less, unless it's just my learning difficulty, the less I find is worth knowing from a lot of that stuff. So there's more comparison and less to talk about with comparison. So that's the distinction that Bob Cowan talks about between a broad humanistic, interdisciplinary, adventurous comparison that's still grounded, I think, in humanities, classical humanities ways of thinking, and then applied comparison, which is hot-wired into policy work. They're increasingly two different fields, but for the moment, in sociological terms, we're all still together somehow. And the space for one has really grown, and the space for the other is really struggling. But I think there's an enormous future for comparative education, because I don't think of the other stuff as comparative education. I think policy science is a different field. And we know, whether it's young students or it's practitioners, they don't get the answers from these large-scale quantitative studies. They know things are extremely complex and interconnected. They know that notions of space have undermined nation and state. They know that representational social science doesn't have all the answers. They sort of know that when you push them. So I think there's a big future for it as an intellectual, Bob Cowan would say, as an intellectual project rather than a policy project. But the question of whether they can intersect somehow and feed each other, that's more problematic.
So I'm not sure I understood the question. I heard you say that, so I talked about the idea of the university, and that there are some hot topics in the university, like entrepreneurship and all that. But what was the question exactly? Sorry.
Yes, I mean there are many new ideas like entrepreneurship, public management, and academic capitalism. Now, there are so many books and articles published recent years. They are quite new, not very new. They are, I mean, if we think of the history of university, their new ideas, they are so money-oriented and market-oriented.
Mm-hmm.
Right.
And do you think it's, how to say, it will benefit the university, or it will harm the university, or it's neutral to the development of university?
Yeah. So I think there's a lot written about, there's a great book called The Fall of the Faculty about the administrative takeover of the university. There's a lot written about the neoliberal university and all that. And I think a lot of that scholarship is very illuminating for some topics. What I find interesting about the higher ed space in Argentina in these universities is that in some very important ways, these universities have been resisting some of these tendencies. The fact that it has been impossible so far by any government in any orientation to impose fees or even an entrance examination to university, right? The idea of the university as an open space, the idea of, so these specific universities are in locations where the university was unthinkable 20 years ago, and they are giving access to a lot of people that had not had access before. But I think what's interesting when we talk about the idea of the university is that these specters and this haunt both the most marketized, the neoliberal university, and these other kinds of universities that are doing other kinds of work. Because these specters are embedded in the ways in which we think about what a university is. So it does not depend on whether the new trends are this or that direction. I think that's what makes it so interesting, is that even these universities that I'm talking about, which try to escape in some aspects of their work these neoliberal trends, they're still trapped within some of the same boundaries about how we're thinking of the university in general.
I mean, I could add a bit to that. I come from a university that was one of the, I have to be careful because there's an official narrative that we've sort of convinced ourselves of, but my university arose out of the student protests in 1968 and is one of the few so-called reform universities in Northern Europe. And when it started, there was no curriculum and no exams, and the students got together in groups and decided which social issues were pressing, and then teachers were, in a sense, a colleague that would help them, give them academic skills and reasoning to go out and turn a practical problem into an academic exercise and then into something socially useful. And that was the history of and the constitution, if you like, and the architecture and structure of Roskilde University. And of course, there's a ghost of that. That's still there, and also a physical element of that, because most of our teaching is student-led project work. And we have a lot of, 50% of the curriculum is based on projects in groups with an oral exam where they have to defend that project. So it's more than just a ghost. But Denmark is a knowledge economy, a high technology economy, so the discourse of innovation is very strong now. There's a discourse of entrepreneurship, and in our case, I've noticed that even in my university, social innovation has become a phrase to replace public engagement or democracy or critique. And so there's a family of terms where there's a capitalist logic somewhere, but that has the potential to dislodge what was a classic, quite hardcore Marxist project about changing bourgeois society through a different type of university into normalizing it and taming it through a different language. So of course in practice, luckily, the leaders aren't able to change it because these things sort of linger. The spirit of radicalness still lingers. But China has its own discursive formation, I would say, in that it is a hyper-capitalist society and is looking for models from abroad, and it's trying to compete as a university, and it understands competition through other market mechanisms of rankings and volume and so forth. So I would be more worried that the capitalist, hyper-capitalist logic could easily transform universities, which lost a lot of their ghosts when critique was stifled in China. So you've got things, I would say, very good institutions that look and speak like universities, but probably what we would misrecognize as universities. They have a different logic. And that may be different in Argentina, the way that formation plays out, and it's different in Denmark.
I'd just like to add one other thing to that, and from what I've seen, it's becoming increasingly more difficult to separate the public from the private in most operations. So here's an inclusion-exclusion problematization, I think. For example, in the United States, the Common Core State Standards was bought and paid for by Bill Gates. His foundation paid to develop those. He paid for the research on those. He paid for the lobbyists at all the state houses to get it adopted. And he pays hand in hand with Pearson to develop the materials for evaluation and the assessments that go along with the Common Core State Standard. I would like to recommend a book by my colleague Sarah Reckow, R-E-C-K-O-W, who wrote a book called Follow the Money a couple years ago, where she traces the roles of foundations in United States educational reform and development. Also, Megan Tompkins-Stang does this, Sarah Goldstein are doing a lot of very important investigative work about the increasingly intense and complicated interrelationships between the public and the private. So, and you can see for the examples when you have Goldman Sachs in the federal government and you have people from Bill Gates Foundation on educational boards. And the money that is spent for lobbying, and then they call it they're singing from the same hymn book as Sarah Reckow and Megan Tompkins-Stang, where all of these groups that are affiliated with what's sometimes called philanthrocapitalism cross over the public-private boundaries in a way that makes a network that looks to me a little bit like the old aristocracy that goes across national borders. So that's another problematizing.
Any more questions? So if there are no questions, I was wondering if the panelists had anything to comment on each other's narratives and discussions. Do you have any questions or comments for each other? No? All right. In that case, we'll just end here. Thank you very much.